The story is told of a farmer. I'm not sure of the details. I think this might even be an Australian farmer. But this man had a big property. He had lots of animals. And unfortunately, it was summertime. Something sad happens when it gets really hot and dry. We get fire season. This farmer received word that there was a bushfire coming, and he was told he needed to get out very fast. So Mr. Farmer and his family loaded up. They got as much as they could into their car, and they drove as quickly as they could away from their farm. There was lots of things they could not take with them, and there were also the animals that they could not take with them. The fire was a big, bad fire, and when they came back a few days later, they were very sad to see the smouldering ruins of their house. The fences had been burned, the trees had been burned, their barn had been burned, and even their house had been burned. As they were going through the charred remains of what was left, they went to the chicken coop, and there was not much there either, just ashes. And as the farmer kicked aside what he thought was a piece of just some wood or rubble or whatever, he noticed that underneath was a bunch of little chickens. And he noticed that what he kicked aside was the mother had protected her babies in that fire, and she had kept them safe. Even though she passed away, her babies were safe under the shelter of her wings in that terrible bushfire. And today, I'd like to share with you a couple of promises from the book of Psalms. This is Psalms 91 verse 4, and it says this, it says, "He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and a bulwark," or a protection, a safe place. That's from Psalms 91 verse 4. I want to share with you a couple of true stories this morning. These stories really happened. These are not made up stories, and they're not even Hollywood stories. They're true to life. Last week we heard about Eric Liddell and also about Desmond Doss. And if you have access to YouTube, you can go after the sermon. I'll put a link in the video. You can go and look at last week's sermon if you missed it. But this week, I want to start off by telling you the story of a man from Russia. This man, I haven't got a picture for him, I'm sorry, because we don't have any photos of him. But his name was Nicholai Panchuk. Nikolai was a Seventh-day Adventist living in Russia, and he wanted to tell all of his friends about Jesus. He went around starting Bible studies. He went around to people's homes because it was illegal to share Jesus' faith where he was living in Russia. If people found out, they would take you to prison and do very mean and hurtful things. He would go around and get a group of 20 people together, and when that was like a house church, and after they had become self-sufficient, he'd go somewhere else and start a new house church. And he planted lots of little churches like that. And he made lots of small gatherings. Well, one day, Mr. Nicholai Panchuk was caught by the secret police, the KGB. And they said to Nikolai, "Hey, Nikolai, can you please tell us what are the names of your church members? What are the names of your friends? If you tell us, we will give you nice rewards, and we'll be nice to your family, and we'll treat you with respect. And if you don't tell us the names of your church members, you know what will happen." And of course, he did know what would happen. Poor Nikolai had a difficult choice to make. What would you do in that situation? Would you start telling the secret police all about your friends that were going to church and loved the Lord? Or would you keep quiet? Nikolai decided he would not tell the names of his friends. He knew that if he told the names of his friends, they'd be put in prison, and probably even worse than that. So he said, "I'm sorry, sir, I cannot tell you the names of my friends." And the guy said, maybe you forgot. And Nikolai says, no, I haven't forgotten, I just can't tell you. So he was threatened, he was beaten, he was taken on a train and shipped out to a place called Siberia, a very infamous place in Russia. And he was sentenced to 10 years of hard labour. Now, in those days, that was essentially a death sentence. Very few people made it back from these work camps. They were not really work camps, they were pretty bad. So he went by train. You can see the picture here. This is a picture of a railway bridge. Can you see the terrain? What kind of countryside is that one? That's, you can see there's a few trees there. There's some water. It was a bit of a swampy area. As he went further and further, he was getting more and more remote. It took him quite a few days. I think it might have been like a week and a half or 2 weeks by train. It's a huge, I think probably more than 2,000 or 3,000 kilometres by train, a long, long way away from his home. As he was on the train, though, he just couldn't help chatting with people and asking, how's it going? He met a guy on the train. Hey, what's your name? Oh, my name's Yuri. How are you, Yuri? Oh, I'm really having a hard time. Now, Yuri was not going to prison. Yuri was just a passenger on the train. But Nikolai was going there as a prisoner. He was going to this camp. And this guy, Yuri, asked this Adventist man, do you know about God? Do you know any promises in the Bible for me? And so Nikolai was able to share his faith over a few days on the train. And the man, Yuri, said, can you please baptize me? And Nikolai said, I'd love to baptize you, but I'm going to prison camp. I can't tell you about, I can't do more than that. As they continued traveling, here's a picture here of a gulag. This is a name for a work camp. Now, this may not be the exact camp that Nikolai went to, but it's the kind of idea. You notice they're going so far north now that the trees don't really grow anymore. They're so far away from the equator, they're getting so close to the North Pole that trees can't grow up that far north anymore. Very, very rugged, very lonely, windy, cold landscape. The only thing that does live up there, apart from the wolves and some of the wildlife, is mosquitoes. Really good mosquito country. Well, after a few days, Nikolai adjusted to life at camp, and he was assigned to work with a man called Vadim. Vadim was the camp carpenter, and Nikolai's job was to help with all of the woodwork, making tables and chairs, fixing buildings that were not working too well. They had a wooden cart and lots of wooden utensils. It was Vadim's job and Nikolai to help him to fix everything for the camp. These guys had gone, I said, about 2 weeks by train to a city and then another 3 days by train. There was no train station when they got to the camp. The train just stopped in the middle of the open tundra. Nikolai and 3 other prisoners got off the train with the guards, and the train kept on going, and they had to walk all day. There's no road even, they just had to walk across the tundra to their prison camp. Very, very isolated. There's no point running away because where would you run to? So far away. Well, Friday night came, and poor Mr. Nikolai thought tomorrow is the Sabbath. This is a Russian work camp. You don't get Sabbath off. What are you thinking? That's crazy. But he went to bed and he prayed. He said, God, please help me. The next morning at roll call, all the men were standing up and the camp guards called out the names. You know, where's Vadim? Where's this man? Where's that man? And then they called, Nicholai Panchuk. And there was no answer because Nikolai was not at roll call. Where's Nikolai? They called for him. They went back to the barracks, and they could see that Nikolai was in his bedroom and he was praying. And they said, Nikolai, why aren't you reporting to work? It's time to work. You're being lazy. And Nikolai said, no, I'm not lazy. Today is the Sabbath. I cannot work today. I'll work tomorrow. And at this, the warden became very angry. He said, this is not the place to be slacking off. Get to work right now or bad things will happen to you. And Nikolai thought, here it comes. But he said, I'm sorry, it's the Sabbath, I cannot work. So Nikolai was beaten up pretty badly. Then he was taken to the camp warden, and they beat him up there as well. So much so that he passed out, and he was unconscious all day long until sunset. And when he finally woke up from his beating, he was so badly injured that he couldn't actually walk. He had to be carried back to his place to sleep. And for the next few days, he was so badly injured he couldn't actually work. By about Thursday afternoon, he was good enough to go and help his friend Vadim out in the carpentry shop. So Thursday afternoon, Friday, and then he's thinking, uh-oh, tonight's the Sabbath. What am I going to do this week? Sabbath number 2 comes out, and the roll call again. They call, where is Mr. So-and-so? Where's Mr. Vadim? Where's Mr. Peter? Yep, they're all present. Okay, where's Mr. Nicholai Panchuk? And there's no answer. Where do you think Nikolai was? He's back in his room praying. The warden went back to him and said, what are you doing here? And Nikolai said, I'm really sorry, sir. It's the Sabbath. I cannot work today. The guard was absolutely furious. The guard took him to the warden, and the warden said, I'm going to teach you a lesson or two. The warden took him to a sod house. Now, this is a different sod house, but it's just mud. They didn't have any trees, don't forget. The wood was very, very scarce and in short supply. So they took this man, Nikolai, to this barn. This is the place where the ox would sleep. And they had a little wooden box. The wooden box was about 1 meter long and about 1 meter high and about half a meter wide. And he said, hop into that box. So Nikolai went into that box. And because it's only 1 meter, it's not quite long enough to lie down. It's not quite tall enough to sit up. And it's too narrow to be able to wrap yourself around like a cat around in a ball. So he could not get comfortable. There's no cushions, there's no padding, there's no mattress, just a wooden box with cracks in the side for the mosquitoes to come in. And he was in there from Sabbath morning, no food, no water. Sunday, I think about Monday, one of the other guys came to take the ox for some work, and the guy called out, Nikolai called out, please give me some water, I'm really thirsty. And so the man was a bit scared. If he gave his friend Nikolai some water and the guards found out, then he would get in trouble too. So he very secretly, he got some water, just a couple of gulps of water, and gave Nikolai some water to drink. After 10 days, he had 3 or 4 cups of water, no food, and then they released him. Now, just imagine, if you're in a box like that, a wooden box about 1 meter long, about 1 meter high and half a meter wide, what would happen to your legs after 10 days of trying to live in a box like that? What would happen to your legs, do you think? He got so numb, he couldn't actually walk anymore. So when they let him out of the box, he had no toilet. He had to go to the toilet inside the box. That was pretty disgusting. The commander took him out of the box, and he was carried back to his quarters. And it took him 3 or 4 days to be able to walk again. He was so sore, and his legs were numb. So he couldn't work Tuesday, Wednesday, sort of a bit Thursday, did a bit of work, Friday, a bit of work, and then Friday night came again. And he thought, here we go, Sabbath number 4. Roll call the next morning. And they called his name, Mr. Nikolai, where are you? And where do you think Nikolai was? Was he at roll call, ready to work? He wasn't. He was back in his room. So the commander called Nikolai, back into the box you go. And this is the second time now that Nikolai's in the box. He's very discouraged. He's depressed. And so at this time, Nikolai said, I'm going to have to do something to encourage myself. I'm so discouraged. I'm so depressed. And so he sang this hymn. And I'd like to ask Auntie Janelle, if it's all right, let's sing the exact same song that Nikolai sang when he was stuck in this box the second time. This is a song from the hymnal, number 529. We'll have the words on the screen. We'll just sing, I think, about 2 or 3 verses. We'll see how it goes. And this song is called Under His Wings. Let's sing it together, please. Very good. What do you think happened to Mr. Nikolai when he started singing those songs in the box like that? He was really encouraged. He began to feel sleepy, even though he had a hard time sleeping before this, and he was kind of depressed and discouraged. He fell asleep and had a really good rest. And for the next 9 days after that, when he was in that box, whenever he got discouraged, he would sing that song again. Under his wings, who from his love can sever? This happened every second Sabbath for 2 years, because he's in the box for 10 days, right? How many days are in a week? There are 7 days in a week. So every Sabbath he went into the box. Sabbath, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The next Sabbath, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday of the second week, he would come out of the box. It would take him 2 or 3 days for his legs to come right again, because he couldn't move his legs. They're all numb. He'd do 1 day of work, maybe Thursday, Friday night, the second Sabbath rotation. He gets called to roll call. He doesn't come, back in the box. This happened for 2 years, every second Sabbath, because every other Sabbath he's in the box. Every second Sabbath for 2 years, until one day somebody very important came to the camp. An officer from one of the big cities, a Russian commandant, or what, I forget the exact title, someone who's very high ranking. He came to the camp, and the camp warden was taking this visiting inspector for a walk, and they went past the barn, and the warden could smell this terrible smell. What's that smell? And he said, oh, it's just where the animals stay. He said, no, I want to check. And they went into the stable, and what did this high-ranking commander find in this sod house? There's a wooden box, and who was inside the wooden box? It was Nikolai. And the commander said, what's this man doing in here? And the camp warden said, this is one of the most horrible criminals we have in our camp. He is a big trouble to our country, and we are trying to educate him. So the visiting commander asked the story, well, what have you been trying to educate him? How long has it taken? Is he learning? And what do you think the warden had to say? Well, this guy's a bit stubborn. We've had to put him in the box a lot of times, and he's not learning the lesson. And the commander asked, how long have you had him in this box for? And the guy said, well, just about 8 or 9 days. And how many times has he been in the box? And the commander thought, oh, how many times? 2 years? Every 2 weeks for 26 fortnights in a year? Oh, probably about 50 times he's been in this box so far. And he hasn't learned yet? Oh, no, sir, this is a very hardened criminal. This officer was furious at the warden. He said, I've seen some stupid prisoners in my time, but I've never seen a stupid camp commander. Can't you see, if after 2 years this guy isn't learning, maybe your methods are not being very effective. Maybe your education isn't working very well. And then the officer turned to Nikolai, and the officer said to Nikolai in the box, he said, is it true that you won't work? Now let me ask you this question. Was it true that Nikolai wouldn't work? Is that true? Was Nikolai happy to work? He was, just not on Sabbath. So Nikolai said, no, it's not true. I will work. I will work harder than any of the other prisoners if need be. I'll get up early and stay up late every night. But I can't dishonor God and work on his sabota, because in Russian they say sabota, sabotniks, the people that keep the Sabbath. So the commander said, all right, we have a new job for you. We have this ox, and by the way, for the last 2 years, this ox had been giving Nikolai some company, because the ox would live in the barn with Mr. Nikolai. In the wintertime, when Nikolai just about froze to death, some of his friends would get some hay and pop it around the box, and they'd move the ox next to the box to try and give the warmth of the animal to keep Nikolai a bit warmer. He was still shivering, but at least he wasn't going to freeze to death. They said, Nikolai, your job now is to look after this ox. The ox had a cart, and every day they would take the ox and the cart down to the river to get water for the camp. The ox cart could carry 2 big containers of water, 2 big buckets of water, and they needed 10 buckets a day for the camp to operate, about 300 men. So they had to make 5 trips every day, 7 days a week. That was the normal thing. 70 buckets a week, or these big barrels, I should say, 70 barrels a week for the camp. So the commander said to the camp warden, Nikolai, you're now going to drive this ox cart. This is a very slow, stubborn ox. The ox only goes as fast as it wants to go. If you want to keep your Sabbath, you need to get that ox to make your 70 barrels of water before Sabbath comes. Now this happened on the Tuesday when Nikolai was in the box and his legs were not too good yet because he's in the box for the last few days. Nikolai prayed to God, and all through that week Nikolai tried to get the stubborn ox to carry the water faster, but the ox was stubborn, the ox was tired, and by the end of Thursday Nikolai still had to get 16 barrels of water to camp before Friday sunset, and he knew that was going to be impossible. And so Nikolai sang another song. I'm going to ask Auntie Janelle, let's sing this one together. This is hymn number 103. This is the exact same song that Nikolai sung when he was trying to get this crazy ox to carry the water so that he could keep his Sabbath. And he was praying, God, work a miracle, please. These people think that I'm worshipping the Sabbath on the Sabbath and that I'm crazy. Show them that you are God. Let's sing this song together, number 103. Was his song. Now, what do you think happened Friday morning? We got 8 trips to go. The previous record for the camp was, I think, 6 trips in a day. He had to do 8. And this is before, and the time that they had 6, he'd gone well after dark, way past sunset. But, of course, Sabbath starts at sunset, doesn't it, on Friday night? So Nikolai's thinking, if everything goes perfectly, I can only hope for 5 trips, and I'll be still 3 trips short for Sabbath. Well, that morning, Nikolai was so discouraged. He'd gotten up early every morning. He got to bed late every night. He's trying to drive this crazy slow ox. And Friday morning, Nikolai was exhausted. He was discouraged. He was depressed. He said, God, I can't do it. Until one of his mates in the prison camp started shaking him. Nikolai, Nikolai, get up. The bull's gone crazy. And he said, if you don't get there quick, he's going to destroy the whole barn. They went into the barn, and Nikolai released the ox to get to work, and before he could even hop on the cart, the bull took off. It was gone. The bull and the cart together had shot out of there, off down to the creek. Nikolai was running after the bull to try and keep up. And this, by the way, had never happened before. This was not a quick ox. This is a slow ox. This is the one that goes this fast. And this morning, Nikolai could not catch up. All the men were laughing at Nikolai. Nikolai, you're a slow man. The bull's gone. he got there to the river. The bull was drinking. The bull was all hot and sweaty and drinking out of the river. Nikolai loaded the barrels on, and almost before he could even put the second barrel on, the ox took off with the cart back to camp. All the men were laughing at Nikolai, trying to chase behind the cart into camp. Normally, Nikolai would go past the kitchen to get some food, because Nikolai would miss breakfast. He didn't have time for breakfast. He'd have to sort of, go to Peter, the camp cook, and say, "Can you please give me some food?" But this time, there was no time for that. The bull just took off again, back down to the river, and this happened 3, 4, 5 times. Finally, the camp cook felt sorry for Nikolai and said, "Nikolai, I can see you're not going to get any food today. Here, have this on the, as he's jogging past. Have this." The last trip happened just before sunset. They got the 8th trip and got all the water to the camp. Nikolai put the bull into the sod house. Nikolai was exhausted. The bull was exhausted, but the job was done. Next Sunday, so Nikolai had Sabbath off. No one could believe it. How come? And they just checked. Actually, there's 70 barrels. Yeah, all the water's there. Next Sunday morning, guess what happened? And by the way, the bull's name was Maxim the bull, the ox. Maxim, next Sunday morning, was old and slow, And Nikolai was saying, "Maxim, we've got to go faster than this all week long. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday." By the end of Thursday, they were still 8 trips short. There's no way. And once again, Nikolai was all discouraged. But interestingly enough, his mates at the camp, they were not discouraged. Only Nikolai was discouraged. Nikolai had tried all week to drive this crazy ox. Friday morning, guess what happened? Once again, the ox was roaring to go and running down to the bank, running back up, and they did the 8 trips again. For the next 8 years, every Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the ox was a terrible, slow, stubborn, useless ox. And every Friday, the ox seemed to be on steroids. Just every Friday. This happened for 8 years. After 8 years, so now Nikolai's been in prison for 10 years. 2 years in the box, every second Sabbath, or every Sabbath, the 2-week rotation. And then 8 years with this whole crazy ox thing. In the process, he baptized the camp cook, he held Bible studies, and a lot of people in the camp became Christians. Finally, the time came when this visiting dignitary, this commander, came back in and asked about how this Nikolai was doing, and everybody was telling the stories. By this stage, Nikolai was becoming quite famous because nobody else could get this ox to do these things that Nikolai was doing. And Nikolai would say, "It's not me, it's God." After Nikolai left, he was sent back home to freedom. He went back home to his family. He went back to being a minister in Russia. And there was a new man who came to camp, a new prisoner. And his name was Gennady. Guess what Gennady's job was? Gennady was the new man to look after the ox. What do you think happened to Gennady when he started trying to get this ox to carry the water? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, big old, slow, ponderous ox. But all the men are whispering, "This is going to be funny, isn't it?" Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday morning, what do you think happened to Maxim the ox Friday morning? And Gennady was not a Sabbath keeper, by the way. He wasn't even a believer. But Friday morning, this Maxim was trying to tear the barn to pieces again, and all the men told Mr. Gennady, "You better go quick before he tears the shed down." So they went off to release the thing. And for the whole day, all the men watched and laughed as poor Gennady now chasing after the ox to try and keep up with him. And by the end of the day, Gennady had succeeded in carrying all 16 barrels of water to the camp. And the warden said, "Well, I guess you get tomorrow off because you've done your job for the week now." And for every week after that, every single week, this man, Gennady, was just shaking his head. He said, "This ox is possessed." So that ox, Mr. Maxim, had the new name, the seventh-day ox. That was the first story. Now, the second story I want to share with you is also a true story, and I'm trying to think about the time. We'll go through it. It's a good story. It's worth sharing with you. Pull your Bibles out with me Psalms chapter 91. Psalms chapter 91 verse 7. Let's read this one together. Psalms chapter 91 verses 7 to 9. This is another true story, and this is also an amazing story. Psalms chapter 91 verse 7 to 9 says this. Maybe we should read it together. Can you see on the screen good enough, or is it a bit too small? Just do your best. If you can read it, come with me. It says this: 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. You will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. For you have made the Lord my refuge, even the Most High your dwelling place. That's a promise in the book of Psalms. I want to introduce you to someone that's a very special man. His name is he's actually a pastor, Pastor Franz Hasel. He was a German during World War II. He was, like Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist. Like Desmond Doss, he didn't want to go to battle and fight. And he also wanted to serve as a medic. Well, one Sabbath, because in Germany they get the mail on Sabbath. One Sabbath there was some mail in the letterbox. And so they thought, we'll wait until after Sabbath, after sundown. In the evening after Sabbath, they opened the mail, and in the letterbox was an official letter from the government saying, Mr. Hasel, you have been ordered for duty for the German army. You have been conscripted. That means against your will, you must report for duty. So he went to the office and reported for duty the following Monday morning. But he had 2 days first. This is Saturday night. He and his family, they got together, they prayed, the husband, the wife, and the 3 children, and they had family worship together, and they sang together, and they sang a hymn I'd like to sing just briefly this morning. This is a good German hymn, this one. We have it in the hymnal number 506, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. This is the song that the Hasels sung together before the daddy had to go to war. Let's sing this one together. We'll just sing a couple of verses out of this one. Okay, listen to the words there. There's a big struggle going on between good and evil, but they say, Jesus Christ, he is the one that makes the difference. Lord Sabaoth is his name. So Monday morning, Franz went to the office, and he was reporting for duty. They gave him a medical checkup, he passed. And he said, I want to be a combat medic. And they said, I'm really sorry, sir. We're going to make you a army engineer. That's someone who makes bridges and does all of the building, construction sort of work for the army. Now, Mr. Franz was very upset about this. He had prayed about it and really wanted to be a medic, but God didn't answer that prayer. And you'll find out why in a few minutes. Now, meanwhile, while Franz, the daddy, was having troubles at the war, he said, I don't want to kill people. I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat pork. I can't work on Sabbath. They were all giving him a pretty hard time, like Desmond. Meanwhile, the wife and the kids, they were back home in Frankfurt, and those of you that know history know pretty well, the Nazi Party was a pretty aggressive political party at the time, and they expected all the Germans to join in and be part of the effort. Now, unfortunately, because the Hasels were Seventh-day Adventists, they went to church on Sabbath. What was the Nazi Party specifically trying to do in Germany at this time? For those of you that know history. They're getting rid of Jews. What do Jews do on Sabbath? What do Adventists do on Sabbath? If a German sees an Adventist, who do they think you are? What happens to Jews in Nazi Germany? It's not good, is it? So now the Hasel family were highly respected in their neighborhood. Everybody knew them to be good German citizens. And so when the Nazi Party leaders came to Mrs. Hasel, they expected her to cooperate. Mrs. Hasel, we would like to enroll your children in the Hitler Youth. Mrs. Hasel, we'd like you to join our party meetings. Mrs. Hasel, we've got this and this and this and that and everything else. And she would say, I'm really sorry, I can't join. Oh, why not? Because I'm Seventh-day Adventist. She got in trouble because in Germany at the time, the students would go to class, the school would go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath. Sabbath was a regular school day in Germany. Every Sabbath, the Hasel family went to church, which meant that the kids, 1, 2, 3 kids, the older ones, they didn't go to school. So they got a letter from the principal saying, Mrs. Hasel, your children are not going to school. They need to come to school, otherwise they'll get in trouble. And she said, I'm sorry, we can't go to school. It's Sabbath. And of course, they were then suspected of being Jewish, which causes problems. They tried all kinds of tricks. There wasn't much food at the time. There was rations because it was all going to the war effort. And the people would knock on Mrs. Hasel's door all hours of the day, the middle of the day, the middle of the night. Mrs. Hasel, we'd like to sign you up for this tremendous war effort. We'd like you to join the party. Can you please sign here on the piece of paper and it will all go very well for you. But of course, Mrs. Hasel wouldn't sign. Sometimes I'd knock in the middle of the night. Oi, Mrs. Hasel, if you don't do it, it's going to be bad news for you and the children. You know what's going to happen if you don't join the party. And it was very, very stressful. It was very, very sad. Now, after a few weeks of this, a lady came to Mrs. Hasel and she said, Mrs. Hasel, I've been hiding, it was a secret, Mrs. Hasel, I've been hiding a Jewish boy at my house, but it's not safe anymore. The people have found out I need to get rid of him quickly because if I'm caught with this boy in my house, I'm going to be in big trouble with the secret police. Mrs. Hasel, could you look after this boy for me? What would you do in that situation? You've got your own children to look after. You've got your own children who are already suspected of being Jewish. And now a lady comes to you and says, can you please hide a Jew in your house? Keeping in mind that it's against the law and it's punishable by death. If you're caught with a Jew in your house, it's bad news. What did Mrs. Hasel do? What do you think she did? She did it. She took him in. She said, I'll take him in. So they had this teenage boy stay with him for a few days, and then she found a way to sneak him out through the underground, and he was whisked off to safety. However, before that boy was taken to safety, one day the Gestapo knocked on Mrs. Hasel's door. She still had this Jewish boy hiding in her house. The Gestapo knocked. Mrs. Hasel, we hear that you have a Jewish boy hiding in your house. We have a warrant to inspect your house. Is he hiding with you? What would you say to that? If the secret police come knocking on your door and saying, have you got someone hiding in your house that we have said it's illegal to have Jews hiding in your house, what would you say? Would you tell a lie? Does the Bible say we can tell lies? What would you do under pain of death? Don't forget, if you tell a lie, you might save your life, but if you get caught with this boy, you might be dead. And she's got the children there. This is what she said. She said, if you want to, you may search my apartment. She didn't say yes or no. She just said, if you want to, you may search my apartment. 3 times the Gestapo asked Mrs. Hasel, do you have a Jewish boy here? And she said, well, you're welcome to have a look. After 3 times, the men just turned and looked at each other, and they didn't say anything, and they just walked off. And the boy was behind the door. He was right there. If they had looked in the house, they would have found the boy, and they would have all been killed. She didn't tell a lie, but God protected her and her family and that boy. Meanwhile, on the front, the husband here, Franz, was being mercilessly treated. Does it ring a bell? Is it interesting that God's people seem to get mistreated a lot? We've got Nikolai in the box, we've got Desmond, Eric in the prison camp, and now we've got Franz here in the German army. One day, the lieutenant said this. He said, Hasel, I see you are reading your book of Jewish fairy tales again. I cannot understand how an enlightened person can believe that garbage. You are nothing but a disguised Jew and a communist. If I had my way, you would be liquidated like them. That's his commander talking to him. He's saying, I think you're a Jew. If I had half a chance, I'd kill you. How would you feel being in those shoes? But God helped him. He went to the camp cook and said, look, I'm sorry, sir, I cannot have any pork. It's against my conviction to have pork. And the camp cook said, what do you think this is, a restaurant? You're in the German army, for goodness sake. Pull your head in, behave yourself, shut up. So Gerhard was given his pork foods, but before he went to the front, they were staying in a small town. He would go to one of the shopkeepers and he'd trade. He'd give them all of his pork and they would exchange it for some dairy produce. So Mr. Hasel was happy, the shopkeeper was happy, it was a win-win for everybody, and Mr. Hasel got to have his food. Unfortunately, Mr. Hasel was also very gifted. He actually had fought, before he was a Christian in World War I, he was a soldier in the First World War, and he was a very good shot. Now, in Desmond's story, Desmond didn't want to even touch a gun because Desmond had a bad experience as a child. Mr. Hasel didn't have a problem with a gun, but he didn't want to kill anybody with it. So he was issued a gun and a holster, but he realized after a few weeks that he was so good at shooting, he was the best marksman in his whole unit, that if he was tempted, if someone were to threaten him with his life, he wasn't sure he would have enough self-control to not use his gun. So he thought, how can I get rid of my gun? Now, a few weeks earlier, one of his friends had sold his gun and traded it for some money or some other stuff. He turned it to money. And when the commander found out about this man that had sold his gun, that man was executed the same day. So Mr. Hasel thought, well, I can't sell my gun because if they find out that I haven't got a gun, that's going to be considered treason. I'm going to get killed. So what he did, late one night, he went out in the darkness to a big lake, and he got his pistol out of his pocket and he threw it into the lake, and it made a big splash. Now, he thought he was by himself, but he wasn't. There were some German patrol officers, some of his teammates, his unit mates, were on patrol around this lake. And when they heard the splash, they thought, oh, that doesn't sound right. That's not a fish. So they called out in German, Who goes there? And they got their torches and shining all around. And Mr. Hasel was hiding like this, because if they found out he'd thrown his gun away, he'd be shot, you know, that'd be it. So he hid. These men went around the lake looking to see what the noise was. They came within an arm's length of running into Mr. Hasel, but they didn't see him. They walked past, went back to the barracks, and then Mr. Hasel took off the other way, went back to the barracks. He tried to act like nothing had happened. And in his drawer, he had a little tiny wooden bracket. And he got some shoe polish out, and he polished it nice and black and shiny. He got his knife and carved it and taped the gun. And for the rest of the war, Mr. Hasel had his holster on his side, and inside the holster was this little wooden bracket, polished up like a gun. It was a pretend gun. For the whole war, that's what he had in his pocket. Now, after a few days, they went to the war front, and now, because Mr. Hasel was in the German engineering group, he was in the very front lines. Whenever they went into battle, his group was always at the very front, because he would lay down the bridges, he would do all of the infrastructure so that the army could come through and drive on the roads or whatever that he created. One day, or one night, he heard some terrible noises and people that were crying and screaming, and he asked his men, "What's going on?" "Oh, that's the secret police, that's the Schutzstaffel, SS, they're doing their business." And Franz found out what this was going on. The German police were doing very hurtful things to the Jewish locals. So from that point onwards, Mr. Hasel began to warn everybody. As they're going into new territory, walking into a new town in Russia, in the Ukraine, he'd tell everybody, as a German soldier, "Hey everybody, my German brothers are coming in a few days. When they get here, they're going to do some terrible things. Everybody run away now." And he would go village to village, town to town. Everywhere he went, he warned, I don't know how many thousands of people, "Run away before my men get here, because when they get here, they're going to do some terrible things." And then Mr. Hasel knew that's why he wasn't a medic. A medic, they come behind to pick up all the pieces, but as an engineer, he was at the very front, giving warning to all the people. I don't think we'll know until heaven how many, maybe tens of thousands of people that their lives were saved because of Mr. Hasel. It's an incredible, true story. As the war continued, some of his conversations began to turn to spiritual things, and he started to talk to his commander about the Bible. In particular, the story in Daniel chapter 2 about the golden image. What's this golden image about? What's the picture on the screen here? I know you know. This is the sequence of the kingdoms that Daniel saw in vision. What does the head of gold stand for? The kingdom of Babylon, way back in 500, 600 BC. How about the chest of silver? The Medo-Persian Empire, up until about 4 to 300 odd BC. And then the midsection, the waist of brass or bronze. It's Greece. And then the feet of iron, Rome. And as Mr. Hasel started sharing these stories, he had this very good idea. He asked one of his leaders, Hauptmann Micus. He said, "Hauptmann Micus, you're a history teacher. You know all about classical history. Tell me if I've got my understanding of history right." And he shared this vision, this dream with Hauptmann Micus. And Micus said, "Yeah, that's true. The history books concur. That's exactly what happens." And then Mr. Hasel said, "All right, at the bottom of the image, what's special about the feet of this particular image?" Okay, very good. And what happens when you put iron and clay together? It doesn't do too well together, it doesn't mix, does it? So then Mr. Hasel asked Mr. Micus, "What does that mean? How is this going to be relevant?" And Mr. Micus says, "Are you trying to tell me that the countries of the world will never be unified?" And Mr. Hasel said, "That's right. Hitler is promising a 1,000-year Third Reich, this big, grand, new age of happiness in Germany. And according to this picture, it's never going to happen.
I've heard that Hitler's secretary was a Christian, and she actually told him of that vision, and he vowed to overcome the will of God.
Interesting. I didn't hear that detail, but yeah, Kim just said Hitler was told by somebody else, maybe his secretary, someone who told Hitler, this is what the prophecy says, and Hitler said, I'm going to go out of my way and prove it wrong. Anyway, from this point forwards, Mr. Hasel's commander started saving up extra diesel and extra food rations because they were the furthest into Russia. They'd travelled, because they're in front of the German army advance, they were the furthest into Russia. They had the furthest way to go to retreat, and nobody was discussing retreat. If you were a German soldier and talked about retreat, you were considered to be not only a coward, but also someone who was treasonous. You're going against the good will and leadership of the Führer. Anyway, interestingly enough, the company commander was sufficiently impressed with Hasel's prophecy that he decided to save up the extra diesel and food. I have to cut to the chase. To cut a long story short, Hasel was miraculously saved. He was picked up by an angel. He was driving along on a cart. They were retreating from the Russians at this point. And he fell off the cart, and the cart came to run over him, and just before it hit him, this big man picked him up and put them on top of the cart. And this man was larger than a real-life regular man. When Hasel got on top of the cart, look around and see who had picked him up, there was nobody there. Hasel was taken into custody by the Americans. They had fled when the Germans surrendered on May 1, 1945. There was a race. All the German soldiers wanted to go back across to Germany before the surrender, before the Russians caught up with them, because they felt safer surrendering to the Americans, who were a bit more humane, than the Russians, who wanted revenge. The Russians were very angry about the Germans and wanted to get even for all the atrocities that had been committed. Luckily for Mr. Hasel, he crossed over the river, I think about 30 minutes before the road was closed. His group was the last unit to get out of Russia, and he was the furthest unit in Russia that made it back. As he was being interrogated by the Jewish American commander, they went through his paperwork records, and the Jewish commander said to Mr. Hasel, Mr. Hasel, I see on your paperwork here that says you have an impending court-martial. Why is the German army planning to court-martial you? And Mr. Hasel said, I'm sorry, sir, but when I was in the German army, I refused a direct order. What was the direct order? The Jewish army commander asked. The American Jew asked the German Adventist. And the German, Mr. Hasel, said, well, sir, it was Sabbath, and I was asked to work, and I said, I'm not willing to work on Sabbath. And I was given a court-martial at that time, but it was suspended until the end of the war. Now the war has ended. I guess I'm court-martialed. At this point, this Jewish interrogator was shocked. He's Jewish. He's in the American army. All through the war, this Jewish American soldier had been unable to keep his Sabbath because it's wartime. And here was a German in front of him saying, I kept my Sabbath all through the war, and here's my proof that I've been doing this. It was a powerful, powerful moment. It was absolutely shocking. The American gave him his release papers. He went back home to his family. He was reunited with his wife and his children. There were 1,200 men in Mr. Hasel's unit. Guess, Stephen knows the answer. I'm going to ask Stephen. Apart from Stephen, how many men survived in Mr. Hasel's unit of 1,200? Only 7 survived out of 1,200. Of those 7 that survived, only 3 of the 7 were not wounded. And guess who one of those 3 was? Mr. Hasel. 1 out of 3 people that were not wounded, 1 out of 7 in total that survived out of the 1,200 who started. And when they were being disarmed, they threw the weapons on the ground. Mr. Hasel got his holster, opened it up, threw it on the ground, and all the men laughed. Because out of his holster came a wooden bracket. What can we learn from these stories today? Mr. Nicholai Panchuk in the box for 2 years, and then this crazy ox for the next 8. He missed his family for 10 years. Mr. Hasel, who was away from his family for about 4 or 5 years, both of them faced tremendous hardship and persecution. What can we get from this? What can we learn from this? Let's go back to Psalms chapter 91. I'd like to just, in closing, have a look at the last 3 verses of Psalms 91. God is in control. God has purposes for us. Remember last week we talked about the sufferings. God promises us protection, but there is still suffering. We talked about that last week. I won't spoil that one. You can go and check that one if you like. But today I want to look at what God is calling us to do. Psalms chapter 91, verses 14 to 16. Let's read this one together. It says this: "Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver." This is God talking. God will deliver him. "I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With a long life I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation." Is this for ladies too? Or is it just men this one's for? It's for all of us. It's for men and women and children as well. Why does God help us? What does it say at the very top? God says, because we love God, therefore I, God, will deliver him or her. I will be with him or her in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him or her. Did God honor Mr. Nikolai? Did God honor Mr. Hasel? How about Mr. Liddell last week and Mr. Doss? Does God honor people? Does God rescue them? Does God help them out? I want to ask you a question today. Do you want to place yourself under God's protection? Do you want to love God? Do you want God to deliver you from whatever it is that we go through? We suffer. We go through hardship. People make fun of us. Oh, those funny vegetarians. Those funny Sabbath keepers. Those lazy people who won't work on Sabbath. You un-German person. Last week it was the Scotsman, Eric. You're a traitor to your country, not representing us on the Olympic Games. Or Mr. Doss, how can you possibly honour your country and not carry a gun? Do you want God to protect you? Do you want God to honour you? Do you want God to provide his divine protection for you? I do. I want God to be in charge of my life. I think all of us want God to be in charge in our lives. If you want God to be your divine protector, if you want God to be in charge, I invite you to stand with me and let's pray together. Let's ask God to fulfill this promise for us. Let's ask God to look after us and our families. Let's be the kind of people that God can honour. God can lift us up, not just for us, but so that all the people around. Think about Mr. Hasel. How many tens of thousands of lives were saved because Mr. Hasel warned them? Run away quick before my Schutzstaffel brothers come, because they're going to cause big troubles for you and your family. Run for your life now. God honours us not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of those around us. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, we are so amazed at how you look after people. We know that you love us and care for us. Even last week's story about Eric, where he died early. He didn't die an old man. but you still honoured him too. And you still, through Eric, helped lots of people to be encouraged and saved and drawn closer to you and given physical protection and comfort. The stories today of Nikolai and of Franz remind us that you want to bless us, not for our own benefit only, but for the benefit of those around us, even those who are unbelievers. Lord, please give us this protection and shelter that you promise. Please show us your salvation that you promise in Psalms 91 verse 16. Please reveal to us that you are good. Give us your shelter. Those of us that are standing today, we say that we want you to lead in our lives, and that is our prayer. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.